The transformation of Europe from the 15th century through the 17th century. Lecture terms. Because this is World History 2 and you have kind of started in the middle of a story, I'm going to give you a bit of background information in this lecture that will help you understand where we are in Europe politically, religiously, economically, and culturally as we move into the 16th and 17th centuries, and this will of course lead us into the 18th century Enlightenment, which will influence the age of revolutions that is to come. So we're going to begin with discussing a little bit about the Renaissance period in Europe. Europe in the 14th century was going through some crises. There were a great number of plagues, the bubonic plague in particular, that hit Europe, poor harvests, as well as a decline in the image for the Roman Catholic Church. A great deal of scandals were going on in the church that hurt its image. There was also a great deal of turmoil when it came to warfare and politics. A lot of upheaval with the feudal system starting to show cracks in the armor, if you will, and kings trying to reassert themselves as a true centralized monarch in many of the countries. After the 14th century, we will see a reawakening, if you will, after tearing down medieval society completely. Society will start to rebuild, and this Renaissance will occur. The Renaissance, this cultural flowering, which will lead to changes in politics, changes in the economies of Europe, as well as changes in the culture in different European countries. It really starts in Italy because Italy controlled the trade in the Mediterranean region, and it will spread north from Italy. Now, the Renaissance is characterized in particular by humanism. Humanism, if you will, is the trademark of the Renaissance period. And by humanism, yes, we mean the study of human culture and human accomplishments and, quote, technologies of the time, but also a look backward to the Roman and Greek classical periods, the rise of rational thought that happened during the classical age, the interest was sparked in that once again. And of course this will foster a sense of individualism amongst a great number of people who begin to study humanism. Classical Greek and Roman texts started to be looked at again. Of course, Italy had access to Roman texts, but they began to have more and more access to Greek texts as the Byzantine Empire crumbled under the pressure of the Ottoman Empire, which we discussed in the last lecture. A lot of the Greek scholars will flee the Byzantine Empire as it begins to crumble, and of course, coming through the Mediterranean region, they will stop off in Italy first. A great number of the rulers in the Italian city-states will invite these Greek scholars to come and establish academies in their city-states. And so, once again, Greek scholarship was in vogue. Aristotle had already had a rebirth, if you will, in the 12th century. But Plato, in particular, became increasingly popular once again. Now, that is what we call classical humanism. The idea being that you look back to the past in order to learn more about human nature and human culture and human abilities in order to see what you can do to make this life a better place. And so humanism, especially the classical brand of humanism, looked to these ancient Greek and Roman texts. And these scholars wanted to read these texts in their original form. You started seeing the classical Greek language being studied once again. All of these people started to read Latin that were not just involved in the clergy. And this, of course, will lead to an educational flowering. Now, this was made even more possible because in 1450, the Gutenberg printing press was invented. And this allowed for the mass production of books. When there are more books, there is increased literacy. It also, of course, reduces the cost of books, so they don't all have to be handwritten. And this, of course, will foster a rebirth, if you will, in scholarship once again. Now, there's another brand of humanism as well called Christian humanism. And this was more the flavor of the Renaissance in Northern Europe. Italy would focus mostly on classical humanism, and Northern Europe focused more on Christian humanism. And instead of looking back to Greek and Roman texts for answers about, humanity and about what to do in this world to make it a better place, they looked to early scriptures in their original writing, the letters of Paul to all of the churches that he established that were incorporated into the New Testament of the Bible. They wanted to be able to read those in the original Greek. Also, other Christian writings from early Latin fathers, written in their original Latin as well, were looked back to. Northern Europe was more concerned about the decline of the Roman Catholic Church, the problems, the abuses that had become apparent, had come to the forefront in the previous century. So, as I mentioned, the impact of this study of humanity, this increased idea that the individual should be praised for his accomplishments, that individuals are important, that man is basically good and his accomplishments should be acknowledged. All of this humanism will have a larger impact and the spread of literacy when Gutenberg's printing press is invented in 1450. This will, of course, byproducts will be a more secular focus of the world and society and how the world and society work together, and less reliance on the hierarchy of the church due to the corruption problems during the late Middle Ages. The Christian humanists will ultimately, even though it may be inadvertently, they will ultimately help to foster a new movement which will lead to the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation is a byproduct of the Renaissance. The idea of looking for the answers yourself, whether it be looking back to classical texts or looking back to early Christian writings, the idea of the individual being responsible for finding the answers himself, ultimately will lead to the Protestant Reformation, especially in Northern Europe. Now, as I mentioned, many were very concerned over the abuses that had been going on in the Roman Catholic Church. And it went all the way up to the top, to the Pope at some point. And ultimately, this will foster folks looking to the Bible themselves for answer. If you can't depend on the clergy because they're too corrupt, then you need to learn to read the Bible yourself to find answers for yourself. It really all begins with a German monk named Martin Luther. Luther lived from 1483 to 1546, And he had originally been a law student, and one day he had an epiphany. It happened to be in the middle of an electrical storm where he was worried he wouldn't survive. But ultimately, he made some promises to God. If he got out of the storm alive, he would join the priesthood. And ultimately, he became a monk. He kept his promise, and he became a monk. Now, he had already been educated in the humanist tradition, looking for the answers yourself, rather than depending on somebody else to tell you what to think. So he continued that practice as he became a monk, and he eventually rose through the ranks of his monastery and became the head, the prior of his monastery. He also did a great deal of teaching of other monks and other clergy members. Luther was extremely concerned with the corruption that he saw in the church, which of course he was now a part of. He became increasingly concerned as he saw in his own country of Germany the practice of selling indulgences become more and more prevalent. Now, indulgences were things that the Roman Catholic authorities could grant to individuals, basically forgiving them of their sins in exchange for something else, rather than them working to work off that sin by doing good works. They could sometimes pay the clergy member, make a donation, quote unquote, to the church. But a lot of what was happening with the selling of indulgences is the profits were being pocketed by many individuals rather than going to the betterment of the church as a whole. Luther, as a humanist himself, began to look to the Bible for answers. And in the Bible, he noticed a couple of verses that puzzled him. And ultimately, the verses that foster the notion of the just shall live by faith alone, that he read in a couple of places, but one of the most significant was in Romans, made him start to wonder if all of the rituals of the Roman Catholic Church, in particular those 7 sacraments, really had anything to do with a person achieving salvation. The Bible, it seems, said that no works could be done to get into heaven. Instead, the grace of God is given to those who have faith. Faith is the only requirement. Good works don't get you to heaven, but faith does. Good works, instead, are a byproduct of that faith that you have. And so this eventually became the basis for a new revolution in religion. The justification by faith became the basis of what will be Martin Luther's 95 Theses. In 1517, having grown weary of the corruption in the Catholic Church, he nailed this list of complaints against the Church, which of course he was a clergy member of. He nailed the 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg, Germany, and it was quickly translated into many languages, and it started to spread. The idea started to spread all over Europe. That printing press is what aided in this spread. One of the reasons why the Protestant Reformation begins with Luther. He's not the first to have such ideas, but the timing was right because the printing press had been invented. And prior to him, other movements did not have the aid of the printing press. So the 95 Theses become sort of his list of complaints against the Roman Catholic Church, and ultimately that promotes the Protestant Reformation, the breaking ties with the Roman Catholic Church to establish a new kind of Christianity, a Protestant, meaning they protest the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, and in particular, the Pope himself. Luther claimed that the Pope could not grant salvation, and neither could any other clergy member, but that it was the justification by faith alone. This will prompt others to move in this direction as well and establish their own brands of Protestant churches. And it is because of the Protestant Reformation that we now have a mosaic of different Christian churches instead of just one Christian church, as there had been for so many centuries. Of course, that was the Roman Catholic Church. Now, Calvin is another one of the superstars of the Protestant Reformation, following in the footsteps of Martin Luther. John Calvin, who lived from 1509 to 1564, was from France. He had read the documents from Luther. He also felt a kind of epiphany himself, and eventually he established a following of people who believed, as he did, that the Roman Catholic authorities were wrong in what they were doing, and he promoted the idea of looking to the Bible oneself for answers, like Luther had. Now, because Calvin lived in France, and France had very close ties to the papacy at this time, he found it prudent to leave France, and he eventually will move to Geneva, Switzerland, which was a free state that welcomed him with open arms. However, there will still be followers of Calvin in France that will have to live in secret or practice their Christianity, their brand of Christianity, in secret to keep it hidden from the Roman Catholic authorities. They will be known as Huguenots, or as we call them now, Huguenots. Calvin differed in one small way from Luther. Yes, he believed that it was faith that gave you salvation, that there were no good works that you could do to get yourself into heaven. But he also believed in predestination. The notion was, if God was all-knowing and all-powerful, then he knows before you are even born if you are saved or not. So therefore, nothing you do can change your fate. It's already predetermined before you're even born. So many would argue, well, then why even bother being pious? But Calvin also promoted the idea amongst his followers that if you are a good person and you treat others well and you are successful in your business and these kinds of things, these may be outward signs that you are one of the elect, the saved. Because why would God allow you to be successful if you were damned? So eventually, Calvin's Reformed Church will catch on and move even outside of Switzerland. The third of the superstars of the Protestant Reformation has to be Henry VIII of England. Now, the English Reformation had a little bit of a different flavor to it than Luther's Reformation and Calvin's Reformation. Henry VIII reigned in England from 1509 to 1547. And instead of having a spiritual awakening or epiphany like the other two did, the reason that Henry VIII broke ties with the Roman Catholic Church were for political reasons, political motives. Henry wanted a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who had not been able to produce a son for Henry to have carry on after him. And he wanted to have this divorce. The Pope refused. He wouldn't give him an annulment either. And ultimately, Henry will break ties with the Roman Catholic Church for completely political reasons. He puts himself at the head of the English Church. The Church of England will also be known as the Anglican Church. And ultimately, as the head of the church, he grants himself a divorce. The spiritual reformation in the Church of England did not really happen until after Henry was gone. His children, some of his children, will pick up and start to reform the church a bit inside of England. Basically, the Church of England during Henry's lifetime was exactly like the Roman Catholic Church, but instead of the Pope being at the head of the church, the monarch was the head of the church. But this will establish a tradition in the Church of England. The monarch will be considered the head and the supreme authority over the church in England, rather than the Pope. Now, the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation, which of course these are the big three I've given you, but there are many others that will foster their own reformations in their own places in Europe. But the Catholic response was severe. There would be inquisitions that would be held throughout the 1500s. They would also foster the creation of a new monastic order that was put in charge of not just mission work, spreading the word of Catholicism abroad, but also of countering the heretics, the Protestants, now living in Europe as well. And this was the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuit order. We've talked about Jesuits already in previous lectures and how they were used by many nations to go and convert native populations where they were trying to expand. And we talked about them many times, how they were used for that mission work. The Council of Trent is another thing that the Roman Catholic Church does. Eventually they will start to clean up the abuses as well. But the Council of Trent basically redefines the Catholic doctrine in the strictest of terms to counteract anything that the Protestants had believed. In particular, the Council of Trent really emphasizes the supremacy of the Pope over all Christians, and any who do not believe in his supremacy ultimately were seen as damned heretics in the eyes of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the impact of the Renaissance can also be seen in the world of science. Just like the Renaissance fostered the notion of looking for the answers yourself to create a better world, and looking to the Bible yourself to find out answers about faith. Ultimately, we see in the scientific revolution the beginning of the questioning of how the earth was formed and how the universe is arranged. Ultimately, the scientific revolution is a byproduct of humanism because these scientists are looking to the heavens themselves, oftentimes building their own telescopes, etc., in order to get a closer look. And they are, through their observation, they are noticing that some of the preconceived ideas that they had about the universe were incorrect. In particular, we see the rejection of the Ptolemaic or geocentric theory of the universe. The geocentric theory stressed that the Earth was at the center of the universe and all the other heavenly bodies revolved around it. That will be challenged by many as we move into the 15th and into the 16th century. One of the earliest to really challenge the idea of the geocentric universe was Copernicus. He lived from 1473 to 1543. And he began to challenge the idea of the geocentric universe because when he looked to the heavens and started to observe the movement of heavenly bodies, planets, he noticed that they seem to move at different speeds, at different times of the year, in different patterns, and the idea of everything moving around the Earth in perfect circles did not seem to explain these times when things seem to be moving differently. And this led him to theorize that perhaps the sun was at the center of the universe instead of the Earth. That would make more sense to help explain why it appears that the planets are moving in different ways at different times of the year. Because in the orientation of the Earth, if the Earth was going around the sun, everything would look different, and that would explain why things appear the way they do when one looks to the heavens. Now, Copernicus had the theory, but he did not really have the math to back up his idea. And so what we see happen in the scientific revolution is another scientist will come along and build on the ideas of those that came before him. Ultimately, we have the beginning of an evolution in science, and in particular in physics. After Copernicus, we have Galileo, who lived from 1564 to 1642. He invented a telescope, a better telescope. He was able to see the heavenly bodies more clearly than any before him. And he was working to try to prove Copernicus's theory about the heliocentric universe. He ultimately believed that he did prove this through a number of the observations he did, but in particular he noted that the planet Jupiter had moons that revolved around it. That would mean that not all the heavenly bodies revolve around the Earth, since Jupiter's moons did not. They revolved around Jupiter. So this would lead him to continue to observe and to continue to come up with evidence to prove Copernicus's theory right. Other things that he will also develop or theorize about as we move forward is inertia. He believed that things in the universe will continue to move in the same direction that they are moving until they are acted upon by some other force. That is inertia. And this, of course, will eventually be built upon by yet another physicist as we move forward. In the 17th century, we have Sir Isaac Newton from England. He lived from 1642, born the year that Galileo died, and from 1642 to 1727. And Newton kind of synthesizes all of the ideas of scientists that came before him in his book, Principia Mathematica. In this book, he basically illustrates all of the ideas that had come before him and ultimately brings them together in the notion that there are natural laws that govern the universe. If one can figure out what those natural laws are, one can predict how the universe will continue to revolve and continue to advance. The natural laws, he stated, are unchanging, and he ultimately referred to the universe as a machine. And God, or the heavenly creator, ultimately created the earth, created the universe, the earth as being part of that universe, and established a set of laws by which it would be governed, the universe would be governed. These natural laws ultimately are put in motion by the Creator, and then he steps back and does not meddle with it any longer. He lets it move in accordance with the natural laws that have been established. Some of these natural laws will be things like gravity, that force that acts upon things to make things change, to make things weigh different weights in certain places, etc., in the universe. This, of course, will open the door for more advances. If there are natural laws that govern the universe, are there natural laws that should govern society? Newton's ideas about natural laws will ultimately have a major impact on the Enlightenment that follows in the 18th century. Ultimately, it will be these new thinkers called philosophers who will advance the cause of reason. The scientific revolution, which opens the door to the age of reason, will ultimately foster an enlightenment. Natural laws give way for more ideas about natural laws governing society and men as well as the universe. And ultimately, this will lead many of these philosophes to challenge the way the society is arranged in Europe. One of the earliest of these philosophes will be John Locke, who lives from 1632 to 1704. He is pretty much a compatriot of Newton, and being British himself, he was very aware of the ideas of Newton, fascinated with the concept of natural laws governing the universe, and he eventually started to challenge the way society was governed, and challenged the notions that kings had perpetuated for many, many generations in European society, in particular absolute government. John Locke felt as if absolute monarchy was incorrect. Now, we'll talk more about absolute monarchy in a couple of slides, but I just want you to know that this notion of the divine right theory of kings, kings saying that they had their power given to them by God himself, and therefore no one should challenge their authority because that would be like challenging God. Very similar to what we have seen in other societies as well. For example, the mandate of heaven in China. Ultimately, John Locke believed that sovereignty in a state does not reside with the monarch. Instead, sovereignty resides in the people in that society. Ultimately, he will challenge the idea of the power of the king being absolute. Locke knew historically that the English government had prevented many from protecting themselves from abuses. And he also recognized that the English government often imposed upon the natural liberties of its citizens. He said that the king was not a divine right ruler, that it's not the king that creates the state and creates the government. It is the people who create that government. And they come together as a society to govern themselves, choosing a ruler to then establish law and order to protect them from evils that can happen in society. Ultimately, the power resides with the people. The people give up some of that power to a governor, a ruler, and they enter into a contract with him. The government is given the power in exchange for providing protection of the citizens' natural rights. If the ruler does not fulfill his part of the contract, if he does not rule with the consent of the governed, then the people have the right to rebel. All of this will be outlined in John Locke's two treatises on government. The natural rights of man that he underscores in this document are life, liberty, and property. And these are natural rights that can never be taken away from them by anyone else. The role of the monarch is to protect the natural rights of man. That will establish law and order, but not to impose upon those rights in any way. Ultimately, this challenge to absolute monarchy will launch a series of revolutions that will happen throughout Western society, and they will change the way societies are governed forever. It doesn't happen all at once, but the kernel of the ideas are there. you will be reading parts of John Locke's Two Treatises on Government as well. His ideas were very radical for the time. There were others, like Hobbes, who had completely emphasized the idea of absolute monarchy, not necessarily based on divine right principles, but based on necessity. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But John Locke is sort of seen as the proto-philosophe, and he launches a new era in this age of reason, challenging the way European society is organized, ultimately challenging absolute monarchy, and that was the most prevalent kind of governing force that we will see in Western Europe at this particular time. Another one of the philosophes is Montesquieu. We'll talk more about him in a later lecture as well. Building on the blocks that had been created by John Locke, Montesquieu, who lived in France, lived from 1685 to 1755, and he wrote a book called Spirit of the Laws. And in this book, he wanted to temper the notion of the, quote, right to rebel that Locke had emphasized by saying that, yeah, some things need to be changed, yes, but we don't want to change everything or throw everything out. There are some institutions that have stood the test of time that need to not be done away with, and one of which he said was the monarchy. However, he did recognize that the monarchy should not limit people or should not impose on their natural rights. Instead of rebelling, however, Montesquieu stressed in the Spirit of Laws that you can reform these institutions to better represent the needs of the people. And one of the things that he stressed was, if you are worried about tyranny, the best thing to do is to separate the powers of governing into different branches of government. So not all power is in the hands of one entity. This separation of powers, as we know, will be extremely influential in the creation of constitutional government, just as John Locke's ideas about natural rights being the basis for constitutional government, limiting the power of the king and balancing it with the power of the people. The separation of powers is ultimately what will be the basis of the government that will be established in North America by the Americans. Adam Smith is another philosophe. He's actually a physiocrat, which is an economic philosophe. Adam Smith lived from 1723 to 1790 from Scotland, and he's most famous for writing The Wealth of Nations in 1776. He also will be a byproduct of this age of reason, building on the blocks of natural laws governing the universe, and of course now understanding that John Locke had advocated that natural laws should govern society, and those laws should be based on the natural rights of man. He extrapolates it to apply it to the economy. He was an economist. He believed the natural laws of the economy act the same as natural laws in the universe. The natural laws of the economy in any place are supply and demand. So when the government regulates the economy and puts shackles on the economy, not allowing supply and demand to determine the market, ultimately that will diminish human happiness and the ability of man to act in his own best interest, which of course is a byproduct of man having natural rights. So if the government, say, used mercantilism, which we have discussed as being the most prevalent kind of economic system, where the government strictly controls the economy in order to maximize the amount of wealth coming into the country, minimize the amount going out, etc. but not allowing for supply and demand to determine the market, ultimately he's putting shackles on the economy and not allowing people to act in their own best interest economically. So Adam Smith and others like him demanded for the change in economic practices, the end of mercantilist economies, and instead using the idea of laissez-faire in the economy. Laissez-faire means let it be or leave it alone. The government should take its hands off of the economy and ultimately allow it to determine itself. And that will ultimately make everything even out in the end. Supply and demand will mean sometimes there will be highs, sometimes there will be lows, but overall it evens out. And that is what the physiocrats like Adam Smith were preaching with their laissez-faire. The last of the superstars of the Enlightenment, which we'll talk more about later, is of course Voltaire. Voltaire was probably one of the most influential of the philosophes. He was a huge critic of the present order in 18th century society in Europe, in particular in Western Europe. He was from France. He was of the middle class, but he was well educated. The middle class, as they became more cash wealthy, as I mentioned before, they started to spend more money to educate themselves. And ultimately, he will become a playwright. He was very radical. Ridicule was his weapon. Irony and satire were used a great deal in his plays. But he will eventually start to challenge the ideas about absolute government and also challenge the ideas of the Roman Catholic authorities. He himself did not believe that there was any one particular organized religion that should be imposed on any given person. He instead believed in a kind of natural religion called deism. Deism was basically the belief that there was a creator that created the universe, set it in motion according to those natural laws that Newton had spoken of, and then stepped back. Ultimately, no one particular organized religion was seen as correct or more correct than any other in the minds of deists. He especially started to challenge the ideas of the Roman Catholic Church by defending heretics, as well as challenging the ideas of absolute government in his writings. He championed freedom and attacked institutions that sponsored intolerance and oppressive policies. Absolute government, organized religion, as well as the class system. Those were the three targets of Voltaire, and ultimately those three things become the major targets of all philosophes during the Enlightenment period. They challenge absolute government, they challenge organized religion, instead focusing on a kind of natural religion. And they also oppose the class system, which favors one person just because of what family they were born into over another. If all men have the same natural rights when they're born, why does society value one more than another? They would challenge that notion. So this new era that we see, that was, of course, it starts with the Renaissance, and then it leads into the Protestant Reformation and changes in religion, and then it leads into the scientific revolution and the changes in ideas about how the universe is arranged, which leads into the Enlightenment and challenges about the ideas of how society is organized and governed. All of this will lead us to a new era, especially as we move into the 16th and 17th centuries, about nation-states in Europe, the building of nation-states in Europe. The rise of new monarchs in the 16th century. What do we mean by new monarchs? The idea of new monarchs basically is another byproduct of the Renaissance itself. The notion of kings being able to ultimately challenge the authority of the nobles who had a great deal of power under the traditional feudal system that existed in medieval Europe. As the 16th century approaches, we will see that monarchs will start to challenge the authority of those nobles to try to re-centralize their own nation states around their power. They also sometimes will challenge the power of the papacy as well in doing this. These new monarchs ultimately are fighting two different tug-of-wars. They're fighting tug-of-wars against their nobility to try to usurp that power that the nobility had under the feudal system back into their hands as a centralized monarch. But they're also fighting the tug-of-war with the Roman Catholic Church, with their idea that they have supremacy over all secular matters as well as spiritual matters. So this new brand of monarch, if you will, that comes out of the Renaissance, ultimately will give way as we move into the 17th century. It will give way to the notion of absolute monarchs. The new monarchs, which will lead to absolute monarchy, ultimately are seen to have power over four basic things. First of all, they have power over finance and the economy in their countries. Ultimately, these absolute monarchs will utilize mercantilism, that economic policy we discussed earlier, strict government control of the economy, as a way to do that. Maximize the amount of wealth coming into the royal coffers, minimizing the amount going out by directly manipulating the economy in one state. One of the major things was you want to limit the amount of stuff being imported into your country from abroad, because that means money going out of your country. But you do want to maximize the amount of your goods going out of your country, of exports. One way to minimize the amount of imports coming into one's country is to tax them heavily. Make it too expensive. If you're in Great Britain, make it expensive to buy French wine by putting a heavy tariff or tax on it. And then, of course, trying to foster your own wine industry at home. That was the other side of the coin, if you will, with mercantilist theory. You want to promote your industries at home so people don't want to buy abroad. But you also want to promote your items to be sold abroad, so that would bring more wealth into your country. So that you had to have power over the economy in order to be an absolute monarch. You also had to have power over the nobility. Like I mentioned before, the nobles had the majority of the real power during the medieval period under the feudal system or the vassalage system. And ultimately, it was difficult for kings to challenge the nobles' authority because the nobles were the ones that were able to raise the armies to protect their portions of the kingdom, their duchies or their dukedoms or what have you. So what the king will have to do in order to challenge those nobility is to make sure that he can raise his own army and not depend upon the nobility for that service. This, of course, requires money. Armies cost money. So if he has mercantilist ideas and is able to maximize the wealth coming into his country, he will now have the money to raise his own armies and without having to depend on the nobility, the traditional knights that had fought during the medieval period. Foot soldiers over knights. You want to have massive amounts of sometimes mostly peasant, foot soldiers. You have to be able to supply them with their weapons, with their arms, however to do that. And that takes money. Okay, so power over finance, power over military. You also have to have power over the church, religion. Ultimately, this means that you don't want to be challenged by the clergy in your realm. You don't want to have any church challenges, and some of the monarchs will use the Protestant Reformation to their advantage to do this. You can challenge the authority of the Roman Catholic Church if you break ties with it, for example, and become Protestant. Henry VIII is a good example of that. He was able to get his way because he broke ties with the Roman Catholic Church and granted himself a divorce, which also meant, by the way, that he didn't have to send those annual tithes to the Roman Catholic Church, and he could seize control of all the church lands in England, in his realm, and do with them what he wanted, like sell them to the highest bidder to create more wealth for himself that he could use to raise his armies. Some kings, like Louis XIV in France, will ultimately remain Catholic, but they will ultimately make the clergy sort of a arm of their own government, where they're not challenged very much by the clergy because they are able to manipulate them to do what they want them to do. And, by the way, Louis XIV will not allow for there to be any Protestants in his realm. He will not tolerate Protestants, and there will be massive killings of Huguenots in France as a result of this. So control over finance, control over the nobility, which ultimately gives you control over the military, and, of course, control over religious policies. Finance, nobility, military, and religion. Those four things ultimately are ways that kings move towards absolute monarchies. Evidence that absolute monarchs were going to be the new way of governing by the time we get to the 17th century really rings true if one looks at the 30 Years' War as an example of the power of monarchs. The wars of religion were over by the early 1600s. Even though, the Protestant Reformation had been going on for 100 years, and it did, of course, spawn these big wars between Catholics and Protestants over the true religion, etc., the 30 Years' War is ultimately a war about politics rather than about religion. Wars for 100 years had been primarily about religious differences, but the 30 Years' War will change all of that. It is an international war over power and sovereignty, and ultimately it will pit big power nations in Western Europe against one another to basically determine who is going to be the most powerful. Yes, religion did get involved at the beginning, but by the end of the war, 1618 to 1648, by the end of the war, it was about balance of power between sovereign nations. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that brought an end to the 30 Years' War ultimately establishes the borders in Europe that will be there for many generations and established a kind of balance of power between the big nations in Europe. The idea of balance of power politics, determining whether or not people go to war or why they go to war, now is the new way of doing things. The idea of balance of power is basically the big kings in Europe do not want any other kings to have more land and therefore more power. Land equals power and influence than they do. And so the borders were established in Europe basically to keep that balance between these new monarchs, these new absolute monarchs. Ultimately, this balance of power, as we move through the 17th and into the 18th centuries, will start to shift in some ways. And when those shifts start to happen, that will cause more friction between nations because the balance is what they want to maintain. Now, absolute monarchs in the 17th century, I mentioned before, many of them will use the divine right theory in order to buttress their absolute power. Divine right, remember, meaning they believe that God gave them that power and therefore no one should challenge their power because that would be like challenging God. But as we move deeper into the 17th century, we will see that there were, because of this age of reason being fostered, there were many who believed that there had to be a better basis for absolute power than just the claim that one had divine right. And this is where Thomas Hobbes comes in. Thomas Hobbes was a big proponent of absolute power, absolute monarchy. And in his book, Leviathan, he explains the ideas of why absolute government is the best government. He does not say it's because God wills it. He instead says it is because it is necessary in order for society to advance. So, absolute power based on necessity instead of based on divine right is what Hobbes was perpetuating. And you're going to be reading some of Hobbes' Leviathan this week as you go through these chapters. So pay particular attention to what he says about why absolute government is the best kind of government. One of the things that he does emphasize is that he believes that the nature of man by his very nature, is greedy and selfish. Yes, man will always look out for himself, but that will lead him to hurt others. Ultimately, because man left to his own devices will cause society to spin into chaos, that man needs an absolute governor in power over him to keep that man from hurting others. So absolute government is a necessity because human nature is so flawed and terrible. He does not have the same opinion of the nature of man that, say, John Locke will, who promotes the idea that man is basically good, that man has natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and those rights should not be challenged by a king or anyone else. So these two ideas, these two men, Hobbes and Locke, are diametrically opposed when it comes to the idea of, a basis for power. Hobbes says power in the state comes from the monarch, and the people need to do what he says because people left to their own devices are terrible, and society will spin into chaos. Locke disagrees. Ultimately, the idea of Hobbes' Leviathan becomes the basis for many absolute monarchs. Some will continue to use some of the ideas of divine right to, justify themselves in power. But many of those new monarchs that depend upon the things that we discussed, power over the economy and over the church, etc., will utilize a lot of the principles that Locke emphasized in his Leviathan. Probably the best example of an absolute monarch is looking at France's Louis XIV, who reigned in France from 1643 to 1715. He was a member of the Bourbon dynasty. He was able to create one of the most elaborate mercantilist systems to govern the economy in France that we saw throughout all of Europe. So he's able to maintain control over the wealth, maximizing the amount of wealth coming into France. So it was one of the most wealthy nations in all of the world during his reign. He also is able to ultimately emasculate the nobility and keep them under his thumb by building a grand palace called Versailles, where he requires each noble to spend a certain amount of time each year in his presence there at Versailles. This, of course, is similar to what we saw the Tokugawa shoguns doing to the daimyo making them live in Edo. Keep your enemies closer. If they are not on their own lands, they're not going to be able to raise armies against you. He also is able to maintain control over religion in his society. Yes, he will continue to be Catholic. But he will not be challenged by the clergy, and he is the one that expels the Huguenots from France. He will also, of course, build one of the best armies in the world in the 17th century, and France will ultimately be able to challenge the power of Spain. Spain will start to decline by this point, and France will become the most powerful nation in all of Europe during the reign of Louis XIV. We will also see that Louis XIV kind of sets the blueprint that other absolute monarchs in other European nations will want to follow to create the same kind of absolute government in their own countries. Ultimately, by the end of the 17th century, most all European nations were under some form of absolute monarchy. Peter the Great in Russia is a perfect example of someone who tries to follow in the footsteps of Louis XIV in creating an absolute monarchy in his own country. Peter the Great ruled in Russia from 1682 to 1725. He established a new capital that was closer to Western Europe in what is called St. Petersburg, named after him. He will try to westernize Russia to mimic the Western nations so they can become a greater nation to be able to compete with Western Europe. And others after him, like Catherine the Great, will attempt to do the same thing. But unfortunately for Catherine the Great, a lot of her ideas to try to modernize and westernize Russia will lead to problems. Most of her ideas were on paper only, and ultimately her failure to deliver on many of her promises, as well as things that she did with church lands, selling them off to the nobility rather than allowing peasants to have a chance to purchase lands, will lead to peasant rebellions like the Pugachev Rebellion of 1773. Ultimately, she will crush this rebellion, acting more like the absolute monarch that she is, and that will lead her to give up on her reforms that she wanted to try to westernize Russia. Ultimately, the results of the Pugachev Rebellion, the bloody results, lead to the mistrust among the Russian population, the mistrust that they have towards westernization. And ultimately, this will lead Russia to be more stuck in feudalism far longer than in Western Europe. Ultimately, Russia will not modernize and not abandon the feudal system until we move into the late 19th century. Eventually, we will see that absolute monarchs will start being challenged by the new ideas brought about by the Enlightenment. We see this happen first and foremost in England with the rise of constitutional monarchy. This really does show that John Locke's principles about the social contract theory of limited government come to being. Ultimately, the ideas of Locke will help assist the British people to move towards a constitutional government where some powers are in the hands of the king, but other powers are in the hands of the representative body for the people, known as the Parliament. Now, this does not happen overnight. As a matter of fact, it is an evolution that happens over a number of generations. It starts where there are tug-of-wars going on between the kings that are trying to rule in an absolute manner, the Stuart monarchs, and, of course, the Parliament that represents kind of the people of England. Ultimately, it will lead to warfare between the two. those that represented Parliament versus those who were loyal to the king, maintaining his absolute authority. The English Civil War from 1642 to 1646 will ultimately lead to the deposing of a king, the beheading of that king, and England ruling itself without a king for about a generation under the Protectorate with Cromwell. That will come to an end with the restoration of a Stuart monarch once again. But later on, a later Stuart monarch will start to behave in an absolute way that the Parliament feels is not in the best interest of the nation as a whole. And ultimately, this will lead to the glorious Revolution of 1688. James II of the Stuart monarchy will ultimately give up his throne, and instead that throne will be given to his daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange. He was the Prince of Orange, which was an area in the Netherlands at the time. And so ultimately the Glorious Revolution will result in a deal being made between the new monarchs and the Parliament, limiting the power of the monarchs and balancing that power with the power of the Parliament. This will begin the first constitutional monarchy. And ultimately, after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, we will see more and more reforms happening in England. Slowly but surely over time, more and more reforms where the power of the monarch will continue to be limited and challenged and balanced with the power of the people. This is known as evolutionary liberalism, and we will talk more about that in part 2 of this course. The Netherlands will also develop a constitutional government, but more so, they challenged, the Spanish Netherlands in particular, challenged the Spanish king that ruled over them. They will gain their freedom from Spain, and ultimately they create what is called the Dutch Republic. They will rule themselves as a republic without a monarch, and once again this republic represents the people. It does not represent equally all people because the representation was largely based on those who had wealth and titles, but it is a step in the right direction away from absolute government. We will talk more about the impact of these challenges of these philosophes in the Enlightenment towards absolute government and towards 18th century society, which promoted the idea of privilege by birth rather than, promotion by merit. We will see these notions challenged more and more and the impact that they will have on the age of revolutions as we move forward in this course. Thank you.